Nothing cuts deeper than being betrayed by the ones who should love you most. When your own parents decide you're worthless, where do you find the strength to believe you matter? In 9th century Norway, Astrid learned this pain when her family sold her like livestock because she couldn't bear children. For 3 years, she lived as a forgotten shadow among traveling merchants. But when the giant Viking warrior Thorne came to her village, he saw something everyone else missed. While others saw a broken woman, he saw strength. While they saw shame, he saw worth. His choice to claim her shocked everyone and changed everything. Now winter is coming, and with it, enemies who want to destroy what they've built. Can two scarred souls find healing in each other when the whole world stands against them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, and Astrid remembered when she used to believe the old stories her grandmother told by the hearth. Back then, in the village of Bjornstad, she had been just another daughter among many, unremarkable perhaps, but loved. Her father Eriksson had been a respected farmer, his fields stretching down toward the water where the barley grew thick and golden. Her mother Sigrid had tended their home with the same careful attention she gave to her herb garden, where healing plants grew in neat rows beside the kitchen door. Those were the days when Astrid's laughter rang through their wooden halls, when she helped her mother prepare the evening meals and listened to her father's stories of the old raids. She had been promised to young Gunnar, the blacksmith's son, and they had walked together through the village paths, speaking of the home they would build and the children they would raise. Life had seemed as certain as the turning of the seasons, but certainty, Astrid had learned, was as fragile as spring ice on the fjord. The healer Ragnhild had arrived on a crisp autumn morning 3 years past, her weathered hands carrying a leather pouch filled with carved bone runes that had been passed down through generations of wise women. The villagers always called for Ragnhild when the sickness came, or when a child was born breech, or when the future needed to be read in the ancient symbols. That day, she had come at Sigrid's request, because Astrid had been married to Gunnar for 2 full seasons without quickening with child. "Bring me the girl," Ragnhild had commanded, settling her bent frame beside their fire pit. The old woman's eyes were clouded with age, but seemed to see beyond the veil of present things. Her gnarled fingers moved over the bone runes with practiced certainty, each piece carved with symbols that spoke of fate and fortune. Of curses and blessings, Astrid had knelt before the healer, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Around them, the entire household had gathered, her parents, her new husband, even some of the neighbor women who had found excuses to visit that morning. The air had grown thick with anticipation and unspoken fears. The casting of the runes was a sacred ritual, one that determined the very course of lives. Ragnhild's hands had trembled slightly as she released the carved bones, letting them fall across the wolf pelt spread before the fire. The pieces scattered in patterns that only she could interpret, their surfaces catching the firelight like ancient secrets being revealed. For long moments, the healer had studied the fallen runes, her expression growing darker with each passing breath. The assembled villagers had waited in perfect silence, understanding that the very threads of destiny were being read in those carved symbols. "The womb is closed," Ragnhild had finally pronounced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. "The runes speak clearly. This woman will bear no sons. The bloodline ends with her." The words had fallen like hammer blows upon anvil iron. In their world, a woman's value was measured by her ability to continue the family line, to birth the warriors and farmers who would carry their names into the future. To be declared barren was to be marked as broken, incomplete, a vessel that could not fulfill its sacred purpose. Gunnar's face had gone pale as winter snow. He was a good man, but he needed sons to inherit his forge, to learn the secrets of metalwork that his own father had taught him. Within the week, the marriage had been dissolved by the village elders, and Astrid had returned to her parents' home, bearing the shame of her failure, But even that humiliation paled beside what came next. The merchant caravan had arrived with the first snows, their wagons loaded with furs and amber, iron tools and silver arm rings. These were hard men who travelled the dangerous trade routes between distant lands, carrying goods and stories from places most villagers would never see. They dealt in practical things, grain and livestock, weapons and slaves. Eriksson had approached their leader, a scarred man named Olaf, who wore his wealth in the thick gold chains around his neck. The conversation had taken place outside their home, conducted in low voices that Astrid could barely make out through the wooden walls. But she had heard enough to understand the bargain being struck. 30 silver pieces, her father had said, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. She can cook and clean, knows her letters and gives no trouble. The healer says she won't breed, but that might suit some men better. Her mother had wept that night, but quietly, so the neighbours wouldn't hear. Sigrid had packed Astrid's few belongings in a simple cloth bundle. Her best dress, her grandmother's wooden comb, a small knife for eating. Nothing else was deemed necessary for the life that awaited her. "You understand, this is for the family," her father had explained as the merchants prepared to leave. His eyes couldn't meet hers as he spoke. "We have your brothers to think of, their marriages to arrange. This shame would follow them otherwise." Astrid had wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of being cast aside like a broken tool. But the runes had been cast, the judgment rendered, and in their world the word of the healer was as binding as the will of the gods themselves. She had learned that morning the bitter taste of powerlessness, the way it settled in your throat like ash. The journey with the merchants had stretched across endless landscapes of forest and mountain, river and plain. Olaf's caravan moved with the steady persistence of men who knew every danger of the road, who had learned to read weather and terrain like the pages of a familiar saga. They traded in towns where strange languages filled the air, where different gods were worshipped and different customs ruled. Astrid had become invisible among them, a shadow who prepared their meals and mended their clothes without speaking unless spoken to. The merchants were not cruel, but neither were they kind. She was simply another piece of cargo, valuable only for the work she could perform. They called her the Norse girl when they bothered to call her anything at all. She learned to find safety in silence, to make herself small and unremarkable. When men looked at her with hungry eyes in the trading posts, she kept her gaze on the ground and her hands busy with simple tasks. When they spoke of her fate in the taverns, wondering aloud what sort of man might eventually buy her, she pretended not to understand their crude speculations. 3 years passed like this. 3 years of existing rather than living, of watching the world flow past like water around a stone. She had nearly forgotten what it felt like to speak her own thoughts aloud, to laugh with genuine joy, to feel that her presence mattered to anyone. The caravan's route was a great circle that took them through the eastern kingdoms and down to the trading centres of the south, then gradually back north as the seasons turned. Astrid had seen wonders during those travels. Great cities where stone towers reached toward the sky, markets filled with spices that made the air shimmer with exotic scents, harbours where ships from distant lands brought treasures beyond imagination, but none of it had touched her heart. She observed these marvels like a spirit watching the world of the living, present but not participating, seeing but not feeling. The merchants had traded in her presence for so long that she had begun to think of herself as they did, a thing to be used rather than a person to be valued. Then, fate had turned its wheel once more, bringing the caravan back to the familiar fjords of her homeland. 3 years had changed her. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been sold like livestock. The constant travel had made her strong. The endless silence had taught her to watch and listen, to notice things that others missed. But she was still marked as damaged goods, still carrying the shame of her barrenness like a visible scar. The morning they approached Bjornstad, Astrid had felt her heart clench with old pain. The village looked smaller than she remembered. its wooden buildings huddled around the harbor like sheep seeking shelter from the wind. Smoke rose from familiar chimneys, and she could see figures moving along the waterfront, preparing boats for the day's fishing. She wondered if her parents ever thought of her, if they regretted their choice, or if they had simply erased her from their memories, like scribes washing words from parchment. She wondered if Gunnar had found another wife, if children played now in the forge where she had once imagined her own sons learning the craft, but such wondering was pointless. She was no longer the Astrid who had lived in that village. That girl had died the day the runes were cast, and in her place stood someone harder, quieter, shaped by years of learning that the world was not a place of justice or mercy. The caravan made camp in the meadow outside the village walls, as was customary for traveling merchants. They would stay for several days, trading their goods and resting their animals before continuing on their circular route. Astrid had performed her usual tasks, helping to set up the cooking area, organizing the supplies, making herself useful in the background where she belonged. She had not expected to see him, but as the afternoon sun slanted low across the fjord, a figure had emerged from the village that made her breath catch in her throat. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking the man who walked with such confident purpose toward their camp. He stood head and shoulders above the other villagers who accompanied him, his presence seeming to bend the very air around him like heat rising from forge coals. This was no ordinary farmer or fisherman. This was a warrior, a man who had seen battles and emerged victorious, who carried himself with the assurance of someone accustomed to command. His hair was dark as a winter night, braided with silver ornaments that caught the light, and his beard was trimmed in the style of the great jarls. But it was his eyes that held her, pale as winter ice, but burning with an inner fire that seemed to see everything, judge everything, understand everything. The village chieftain walked beside him, speaking in respectful tones, clearly treating this stranger as a man of great importance. Other warriors followed in his wake, all of them bearing the marks of professional soldiers, well-maintained weapons, quality armor, the confident bearing of men who had faced death and found it wanting. "Who is that?" one of the younger merchants had whispered, echoing the question in Astrid's own mind. "Trouble," Olaf had replied grimly, but his eyes had held a calculating gleam. Where others saw danger, the merchant saw opportunity, and that recognition would prove to be the moment when everything changed. The stranger's name was Thorne Grimson, and he had come to claim what was rightfully his. Astrid learned this as she crouched behind the supply wagons, listening to the tense negotiations between the giant warrior and chieftain Ragnar. The conversation carried clearly across the evening air, each word weighted with implications that made the assembled villagers shift nervously on their feet. "My grandfather held these lands before the great wars." Thorne's voice rumbled like distant thunder, calm, but carrying an undertone of absolute certainty. "Grim the Red settled here when your fathers were still suckling babes. I have come to reclaim what blood and battle earned." Ragnar, a greying man who had led Bjornstad for 20 years, found himself in an impossible position. The documents Thorne carried bore the seals of distant kings, legal claims written in Latin by learned scribes. More importantly, the warrior had brought 40 seasoned fighters with him, men whose weapons gleamed with recent care, and whose eyes held the cold confidence of proven killers. "The land grants were made in good faith," Ragnar replied carefully, his diplomatic training evident in every measured word. "My people have worked these fields for generations." "Surely some arrangement." "I seek no conflict with honest folk," Thorne interrupted, but his pale eyes remained fixed on the chieftain's face like a wolf studying its prey. "Those who serve faithfully will find their place in my household. Those who resist will find the sea a cold grave." The threat hung in the air like morning frost, beautiful and deadly. Around the warriors, the villagers murmured among themselves, weighing their options with the practical wisdom of people who had survived by adapting to changing circumstances. A new lord meant new opportunities for some, disaster for others. "There is the matter of tribute," Thorne continued, gesturing toward the merchant wagons where Astrid remained hidden. I understand you trade regularly with these travelers. A portion of their goods will serve as my first collection from these lands. Olaf stepped forward then, recognizing both opportunity and danger in equal measure. The scarred merchant had built his fortune by reading the currents of power and positioning himself advantageously when the winds changed. His calculating gaze swept over Thorne's warriors, counting weapons and assessing strengths with a trader's eye for valuable assets. "My lord," Olaf said, offering a respectful bow that managed to convey submission without surrendering dignity. "Perhaps we might discuss terms that benefit all parties. I carry goods that might interest a man of your station. Show me," Thorne commanded simply. What followed was a demonstration of the merchant's finest wares: furs from the far north where the white bears roamed, amber carved into intricate jewelry, steel blades forged in the eastern kingdoms where metalwork had been perfected over centuries. Each item was presented with the showmanship of a man who understood that selling was equal parts theater and negotiation. But Thorne's attention seemed elsewhere, his pale gaze sweeping across the camp with methodical precision. When his eyes found Astrid crouched behind the wagons, she felt a shock like touching forge iron, a recognition that cut through her carefully constructed invisibility like a blade through silk. For a moment that stretched like eternity, their gazes locked across the firelit space. She saw something flicker in those winter-pale eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of a different sort. Then his attention returned to the merchant's presentation, but Astrid knew with bone-deep certainty that she had been seen, truly seen. "For the first time in 3 years, you carry other cargo," Thorne observed, his voice carrying a casual tone that somehow made every man in the camp tense. "I see cooking gear arranged for more than your number, woman's work in the camp preparations." Olaf's smile became strained around the edges. "Ah, yes, my lord. A practical matter. We carry a serving woman to tend to such tasks. Nothing of particular value, merely bring her forward." The command was spoken quietly, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Astrid felt her heart hammer against her ribs as every eye in the camp turned toward her hiding place. There was no choice but to obey. Resistance would only bring attention she could not afford. She rose slowly from her position behind the wagons, smoothing her simple woolen dress with hands that trembled only slightly. 3 years of careful invisibility had taught her to move without drawing notice, but now she felt exposed under the scrutiny of so many watching eyes. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground as she approached the circle of men, falling into the submissive posture that had become second nature. "Look at me," Thorne commanded. The words hit her like physical blows. For 3 years, she had survived by keeping her eyes downcast, by making herself small and unremarkable. To meet a powerful man's gaze directly was to invite attention she could not handle, to risk the kind of consequences that had taught her the value of silence. But something in his voice compelled obedience. Slowly, reluctantly, she raised her eyes to meet his. The world seemed to stop. Up close, Thorne Grimson was even more imposing than distance had suggested. He stood well over 6 feet in height, his frame built with the solid muscle of a man who had spent his life in armor and battle. Scars crossed his visible skin, like a map of old conflicts, a thin line along his jaw, another disappearing beneath his tunic collar, the mark of a blade that had come within inches of ending his life. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of winter ice, pale blue-gray that seemed to see beyond surface things into the truth beneath. There was intelligence there, and something else, a recognition that made her breath catch in her throat. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice gentler than she had expected. "Astrid," she whispered, the words scraping past lips that had grown unaccustomed to speaking her own identity aloud. "Astrid," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "A good Norse name. You are from this region?" She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Around them, she could feel the tension of the assembled men, the weight of attention focused on an exchange they did not understand. "She was born in Bjornstad," Olaf interjected quickly. clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Her family sold her to my caravan some years past. A useful worker, though marked as barren by the local healer. Still, she serves well enough for camp duties. Astrid felt the familiar shame burn through her at the casual mention of her failure, the way her barrenness was discussed like a flaw in a piece of trade goods. She had heard such conversations countless times during her years with the merchants, but it never stopped cutting like a fresh wound. Something shifted in Thorne's expression, a tightening around his eyes, a subtle hardening of his features that suggested barely controlled anger. But when he spoke, his voice remained calm. "The price? My lord?" Olaf looked genuinely confused. "Name your price for the woman." The silence that followed was deafening. Astrid felt the ground seem to shift beneath her feet as the implications of those words sank in. Around the circle, men exchanged glances of surprise and speculation. In their world, warriors of Thorne's status could claim whatever they desired by right of strength. But he was choosing to negotiate like an honorable man. That is, Olaf stammered, clearly calculating rapidly. "She has been useful to our operations, my lord. Perhaps 50 silver pieces might..." "Done!" The word was spoken with such finality that it seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Thorne reached into the leather pouch at his belt and counted out the silver with methodical precision, each coin ringing against the others like tiny bells announcing a transformation. "But my lord," Ragnar ventured carefully, "surely a man of your status deserves better than a barren woman. There are young maids in the village, daughters of good families who could serve your household with honor." Thorne's pale gaze fixed on the chieftain with an intensity that made the older man step back involuntarily. "I choose what serves my purposes," he said quietly. "And I have chosen." As the silver changed hands and the deed was completed, Astrid felt her world tilt on its axis once again. She had grown accustomed to being property, to having her fate decided by others without her input or consent. But something in the way Thorne looked at her suggested this transaction was different, that perhaps, for the first time in 3 years, she was being seen as more than damaged goods. The giant warrior turned to her then, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Gather your belongings," he said simply. "You belong to my household now." As she moved to collect her few possessions, the same pitiful bundle her mother had packed 3 years ago, Astrid wondered if her fate was improving or if she was simply trading one form of servitude for another. But deep in her chest, something long dormant stirred to life, an ember of hope she had thought extinguished forever. Behind her, she could hear Olaf already spinning the tale for his fellow merchants, embellishing the story of the mysterious warrior who had paid 50 silver pieces for a barren woman. By morning, the tale would spread through the village like wildfire, and by winter's end it would be legend. But Astrid was no longer listening to other people's stories about her life. For the first time in 3 years, she wondered if she might have a story of her own to tell. The great hall that had once belonged to Chieftain Ragnar now served as Thorne's seat of power, though the transition had been accomplished with surprisingly little bloodshed. The massive oak beams overhead bore witness to generations of feasts and councils, their smoke-darkened surface carved with runes that spoke of prosperity and protection. Tonight, those ancient symbols looked down upon a scene that would have been unthinkable just days before. Astrid knelt beside the hearth, tending the fire that cast dancing shadows across the wooden walls. Her new position in Thorne's household was undefined, neither slave nor servant, but something in between that left her uncertain of her place in the complex hierarchy of warriors and workers. The woolen cloak draped across her shoulders was finer than anything she had owned in years, a deep blue fabric that Thorne had provided without explanation or ceremony. Around the hall, his men shared ale and spoke in the rough voices of professional soldiers, their conversations punctuated by the clash of wooden cups and the occasional burst of harsh laughter. These were hard men who had followed their lord across dangerous seas and foreign battlefields, bound to him by loyalty earned through shared hardship and proven leadership. The western fields will need clearing before spring planting, reported Bjorn Iron Arm, Thorne's lieutenant and closest advisor. The grizzled warrior bore scars that told stories of battles fought in distant lands, his left hand missing 2 fingers from what Astrid guessed had been a sword stroke that had come too close. The previous holders let the forest encroach too far. "See it done," Thorne replied from his position in the high seat, the carved chair that marked him as lord of this domain. His pale eyes surveyed the hall with the methodical attention of a man accustomed to command, noting every detail that might affect the security and prosperity of his holdings. "What of the village families?" "Most have accepted the change," Bjorn continued, consulting notes scratched on a wooden tablet. "The blacksmith Gunnar asks permission to continue his trade. Several of the farmers request confirmation of their land rights. The widow Helga offers her services as healer, claiming knowledge of herb lore." At the mention of Gunnar's name, Astrid felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Her former husband, though that brief marriage seemed like something from another lifetime, had always been a practical man. His quick acceptance of the new order spoke to the same pragmatic nature that had led him to dissolve their union when she was declared barren. Grant them what they seek. Thorne decided after a moment's consideration. Stability serves our purposes better than fear, but place watchers among them. Old loyalties die hard, and some may harbor thoughts of rebellion. The business of ruling continued around her as Astrid performed the simple tasks that kept the hall functioning. She prepared trenches of food, refilled ale cups, and maintained the fires that held back the autumn chill. The work was familiar, not so different from her duties with the merchant caravan, but the atmosphere was entirely changed, where Olaf's men had treated her as a useful tool to be ignored when not needed. Thorne's warriors seemed uncertain how to behave around her. Word had spread quickly through the ranks about the price their lord had paid for a supposedly barren woman, creating an air of speculation that followed her movements like smoke from green. "Wood, 50 silver pieces for damaged goods," she heard one of the younger warriors mutter to his companion as she passed their table. "The Lord's judgment in battle is without question." But this choice puzzles even his closest followers. His companion, an older man with grey threading his braided beard, cuffed him sharply across the back of the head. "Mind your tongue, whelp. Lord Thorne sees things we do not. That much has been proven in a dozen battles. If he values the woman, there are reasons we have yet to understand." The exchange was typical of the conversations that died to whispers when she approached, resuming in hushed tones after she had passed. Everyone in the hall was trying to understand Thorne's motivations, to solve the puzzle of why a powerful Jarl would claim a woman marked as worthless by their own customs. Astrid found herself wondering the same thing as she worked. During her years with the merchants, she had learned to read the desires and intentions of men through careful observation. Some wanted simple physical comfort, others sought validation of their power through dominance. Still others pursued the fantasy of owning something beautiful and exotic, but Thorne's behavior fit none of these familiar patterns. He treated her with a distant courtesy that was neither warm nor cold, issuing simple instructions without the casual cruelty she had grown to expect. When their eyes met across the hall, she saw something in his gaze that reminded her of the way her grandmother had looked at injured birds, a recognition of damage, combined with patient assessment of what might be healed. The evening meal was interrupted by the arrival of a delegation from the village, led by her own father Eriksson. Astrid felt her breath catch in her throat as the man who had sold her entered the hall, his eyes carefully avoiding the section where she knelt by the fire. 3 years had aged him considerably. His hair had gone completely grey, and new lines bracketed his mouth like parentheses of regret. "Lord Thorne," Eriksson said, offering a bow that managed to convey respect without complete submission. "We come to welcome you properly to our lands, and to discuss the arrangements for the coming season." "Speak," Thorne commanded. his voice carrying no particular warmth or hostility. "The harvest has been good this year," Ericsson continued, his practiced words suggesting he had rehearsed this speech. "We can offer a fair portion as tribute, along with skilled labor for whatever projects you might require. The village prospers when leadership is strong and just." Other village elders nodded their agreement, a careful choreography of acceptance designed to secure their positions under the new order. Astrid watched the performance with the detached interest of someone observing strangers. Feeling no connection to these people who had been her neighbors and family, "Your tribute will be set at 1/3 of the harvest," Thorne decided after considering their proposal. "Reasonable for prosperous lands. But there is another matter we must address." The temperature in the hall seemed to drop several degrees as every person present sensed the shift in Thorne's tone. His pale gaze fixed on Ericsson with laser precision, and the farmer's face began to pale under that unwavering stare. "3 years ago, you sold your daughter to traveling merchants," Thorne continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. "You took silver for your own blood, cast her aside when she was declared unsuitable for breeding. This speaks to your character, Farmer Ericsson." The silence that followed was deafening. Around the hall, warriors stopped their conversations to watch the confrontation unfold, while the village delegation shifted nervously on their feet. Ericsson's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, his face cycling through expressions of fear, shame, and desperate calculation. "My lord," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The healer's judgment was clear. "The girl is marked as barren. I acted to preserve my family's honor, to protect my son's prospects for marriage. Surely you understand." "I understand that you valued 30 pieces of silver more than your daughter's life," Thorne interrupted, rising from his chair with fluid grace that somehow made the movement seem threatening. "I understand that when faced with difficulty, you chose the path of greatest convenience rather than greatest honor." Astrid felt tears she hadn't shed in years burning behind her eyes as she watched. Her father faced judgment for the choice that had destroyed her world. Part of her felt vindicated to see him called to account, while another part mourned the love that had once existed between them. "The woman you discarded now serves in my household," Thorne continued, his words falling like hammer blows on anvil iron. "She has proven herself capable, loyal, and worthy of respect. Your loss is my gain, farmer, but that does not absolve you of the shame you carry." The message was clear to everyone present. Astrid was under Thorne's protection now, and any who had wronged her in the past would answer to him for their choices. The carved wooden box sat on the table like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Astrid stared at it from across the chamber, her hands still busy with the mending that had become her evening routine. The firelight played across its surface, revealing intricate knotwork that spoke of skilled craftsmanship and considerable value. Thorne had placed it there after the morning meal without explanation, and it had remained untouched through the long autumn day. "It belonged to my sister," he said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. His voice carried a weight of old grief, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. "She would have been about your age now, had she lived." Astrid's needle paused in its work as she processed this unexpected revelation. In the 2 weeks since her father's humiliation in the Great Hall, Thorne had spoken to her with increasing frequency, but their conversations had remained safely practical, instructions about household duties, observations about the weather, brief exchanges about the running of his domain. This was the first time he had offered anything personal about his past. "What happened to her?" she asked softly, setting down her mending to give him her full attention. "Fever took her during the winter of my 15th year, Thorne replied, his pale eyes fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. "Astrid was her name as well. Perhaps that is why you caught my attention so quickly in the merchant camp. She had the same quality of careful observation, the same way of seeing things others missed. The coincidence of names hung in the air between them, a thread of connection that seemed to explain something that had puzzled them both. Astrid felt a strange mixture of honor and burden at carrying the name of someone so clearly beloved, understanding now why Thorne sometimes looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. She was to be married to a neighboring Jarl's son, he continued, his voice growing distant with memory. A political alliance that would have secured our family's position for generations. But she preferred books to battles, healing herbs to household management. She used to say that the gods had given her hands meant for creating, not for bearing children to serve other men's ambitions. Astrid nodded, recognizing something of herself in this long-dead sister. How many women, she wondered, had been judged by their ability to fulfill roles chosen by others rather than their own dreams and capabilities? The box contains her collection of medicinal knowledge, Thorne explained, gesturing toward the carved container. Seeds, dried herbs, written instructions for their use. She spent years gathering wisdom from every healer who would teach her, including some who claimed knowledge of fertility treatments. The implication hit Astrid like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat as she understood what he was offering. Not just access to healing knowledge, but the possibility that the healer's pronouncement might not be the final word on her fate. The runes had declared her barren, but runes could be misread and healers could make mistakes. "Why are you showing me this?" she whispered, afraid to hope but unable to stop herself from wondering. "Because I have seen how you tend the wounded among my men," Thorne replied, his gaze returning to her face with that unsettling directness. "You have gentle hands and a careful mind. Perhaps the gods meant for you to follow a different path than the one others chose for you." Over the following days, Astrid found herself drawn to the wooden box like iron to lodestone. The contents were a revelation. Carefully labeled packets of seeds, bundles of dried herbs tied with colored thread, and several sheets of parchment covered with detailed notes in a feminine hand. Thorne's sister had possessed both intelligence and dedication, creating a comprehensive guide to herbal medicine that rivaled anything Astrid had seen in her travels. She began small, testing remedies on minor ailments among the household staff. A poultice for Bjorn's recurring shoulder pain, a tea to ease the cook's persistent cough, a salve for the cuts and scrapes that were inevitable in a warrior's life. Each success built her confidence and earned her a measure of respect from people who had previously seen her only as their lord's mysterious acquisition. But it was the fertility treatments that consumed her thoughts during the long evening hours. The sister's notes described combinations of herbs that might regulate a woman's monthly cycles, dietary changes that could improve the chances of conception, even specific timing recommendations based on lunar observations. The knowledge was both tantalizing and terrifying. Hope was a luxury Astrid had learned to live without, and allowing it back into her heart felt like inviting fresh pain. "You have questions," Thorne observed one evening as they shared their meal in the relative privacy of his personal chambers. The great hall had grown too public for the kind of conversations they found themselves having, requiring a space where words could be spoken without being overheard and analyzed by curious ears. "Many questions," Astrid admitted, setting down her eating knife to meet his gaze directly. The ability to look him in the eye had returned gradually over the past weeks, a small victory over the submissive habits that had kept her safe but invisible. "Why did you really choose me? 50 silver pieces could have bought you anything else in that merchant's inventory." Thorne considered her question with the same careful attention he gave to matters of strategy and governance. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and deliberate. "I have seen many broken things in my travels," he said quietly. "Broken weapons, broken fortifications, broken men. Most people see only the damage and write off the whole as worthless. But sometimes, if you look carefully, you can see that the breaking was not complete, that with patience and skill, what was damaged might be made strong again. And you think I can be made strong again?" "I think you were never truly broken," he replied, his pale eyes holding hers with steady conviction. "I think you were judged by people who lacked the wisdom to see your actual value. The healer who cast those runes saw only one possible future for a woman, But the gods write many different fates for those willing to seek them. That night, Astrid lay awake on her sleeping pallet, staring at the carved wooden box that now sat beside her bed. The herbs it contained represented possibility, dangerous, fragile, but undeniably real. For 3 years, she had accepted the verdict of her barrenness as immutable truth, the final word on her worth as a woman and a human being. But Thorne's sister had believed differently. The careful notations in the margins of her herbal guides spoke of successes where other healers had predicted failure, of women who had conceived children after being declared hopeless cases. Perhaps the gods had not written the final chapter of Astrid's story after all. As winter deepened around the village, Astrid began to experiment with the treatments described in the ancient texts. She approached the work with the same methodical care she had learned during her years of survival, documenting her observations and adjusting the preparations based on her body's responses. The process was slow and often uncomfortable, but for the first time in years, she felt as though she was actively shaping her own destiny, rather than simply enduring it. The changes were subtle at first. A regularity in her cycles that had been absent since her marriage to Gunnar. A sense of physical vitality that she had almost forgotten. But more importantly, she felt something shift in the way she carried herself. A gradual shedding of the invisible cloak of shame that had wrapped around her shoulders like a burial shroud. Thorne watched these changes with approval, but did not comment directly, allowing her the space to discover her own strength without interference or pressure. His restraint was itself a gift, the freedom to heal at her own pace, to experiment with hope without the burden of his expectations. The iron wedding torque gleamed dully in the candlelight, its twisted metal surface bearing runes that spoke of binding and permanence. Thorne held the ancient piece of jewelry with reverence, his scarred fingers tracing the symbols that had been carved by his grandfather's own hand. The torque had adorned the throats of Grimson brides for 4 generations, each woman who wore it becoming part of a lineage that stretched back to the earliest days of their family's prominence. The village elders grow restless, Bjorn reported during their morning council, his weathered face creased with concern. They whisper that a lord without a wife lacks the stability needed for proper governance. Some suggest that your attachment to the former merchant's woman shows poor judgment in matters of lineage. Astrid felt her cheeks burn with familiar shame as she served ale to the assembled men, each word cutting through her carefully constructed composure like blades through silk. 3 months had passed since her arrival in Thorne's household, and while her position had grown more secure, it remained frustratingly undefined. She was neither servant nor concubine, neither wife nor slave, existing in a liminal space that bred speculation and gossip among both the warriors and the villagers. "What manner of stability do they seek?" Thorne asked, his voice carrying a dangerous calm that made several men shift nervously in their seats. "My lands are prosperous, my borders secure, my justice fair and consistent. What failing do they perceive in my leadership?" "None in your leadership, my lord," Bjorn replied carefully, clearly navigating treacherous conversational waters. "But tradition holds that a jarl's bloodline must be secured through proper marriage. The people need assurance that your house will continue, that the alliances and protections you offer will survive beyond your own lifetime." The discussion continued around topics that had become depressingly familiar to Astrid over the past weeks. Marriage offers had arrived from neighboring jarls, seeking to cement alliances through the ancient bonds of kinship. Each proposal was carefully considered and politely declined, but the pressure was mounting like water behind a dam, threatening to burst forth in ways that could destabilize everything Thorne had worked to build. "There is also the matter of the spring raids," added Olaf Redbeard, Thorne's newest lieutenant, and a man whose strategic mind had proven invaluable in recent months. "The coastal settlements grow bold in their resistance to our authority. A decisive campaign would remind them of the consequences of defiance. But such ventures require absolute loyalty from your followers." The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. Warriors followed leaders they respected completely, and doubt about Thorne's personal choices could undermine the absolute confidence needed for successful military campaigns. Men would die if they hesitated at crucial moments, wondering if their lord's judgment could be trusted. Astrid retreated to her position by the fire, using the familiar motions of tending the flames to mask the turmoil in her heart. She had grown to value the strange sanctuary she had found in Thorne's household, the first real safety she had known since childhood. But she was not naive about the forces arrayed against their unconventional arrangement. The political reality was stark and unforgiving. Thorne needed a wife who could bear him sons, cement alliances, and provide the social legitimacy that his position required. He needed a woman of noble birth who could navigate the complex web of relationships that bound the great houses together in networks of mutual obligation and support. He did not need a barren former slave whose very presence reminded everyone of his inexplicable choices. Later that evening, as the hall emptied and the household settled into its nightly routines, Astrid found herself alone with Thorne for the first time in days. The demands of leadership had kept him occupied with a constant stream of visitors, petitioners, and administrative duties that left little time for personal conversation. "You've been quiet today," he observed, settling into his chair beside the fire with the careful movements of a man whose body bore the accumulated damage of years of warfare. A recent training accident had aggravated an old wound in his left shoulder, and Astrid had been treating it with poultices made from his sister's herbal recipes. "I've been thinking," she replied, not entirely certain how to voice the conclusions she had reached during her long hours of solitary reflection. "About the future, about what this household needs to prosper, and what conclusions have you drawn?" The question was asked with genuine interest, free from the patronizing tone she might have expected from a man addressing a woman of her uncertain status. Over the months, Thorne had developed the habit of seeking her observations on various matters, greeting her insights with a respect that still surprised her. "You need a proper wife," she said simply, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. "Someone who can give you sons, secure alliances, provide the legitimacy that your position requires. The longer you delay, the more it appears that your judgment is compromised by whatever this is between us." Thorne's pale eyes studied her face with that unsettling directness she had come to know so well. "And what would you call this thing between us, Astrid? How would you name what has grown here over these months?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy with implications that neither of them had been willing to address directly. What had begun as a simple transaction had evolved into something more complex, a bond that defied easy categorization. They were not lovers in the physical sense, but there was an intimacy in their daily interactions that went far beyond the relationship between lord and servant. "I do not know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I only know that it cannot continue if it threatens everything you have worked to build. Your men need to believe in your wisdom, your judgment, your strength. If they begin to doubt, then let them doubt," Thorne interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "I have built my reputation on results, not on conformity to other men's expectations. My judgment has kept them alive through a dozen campaigns, filled their purses with gold, and given them lands to call their own. If they wish to question that record based on their prejudices about marriage and bloodlines, they are welcome to seek service elsewhere. But the alliances can be forged through many means other than marriage beds," he finished, rising from his chair to pace before the fire like a caged wolf. "I am not some untested youth who needs a wife's family connections to legitimize his authority. I've earned my position through strength and cunning, and I will maintain it the same way." Astrid watched him move, noting the tension in his shoulders that spoke of deeper frustrations than he was willing to voice. She had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods over the past months, understanding that his calm exterior often masked the intensity of his emotions. "There is something else," she said quietly. steeling herself for a revelation that might change everything between them. The herbs, the treatments your sister documented, I believe they are working. Thorne stopped pacing, his entire body going still with sudden attention. Working how? My cycles have become regular for the first time since my marriage to Gunnar. The cramping that plagued me for years has lessened. I feel different, stronger, more like the woman I was. Before the healer's pronouncement destroyed my sense of self, the silence that followed was filled with the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the household. Settling for the night, Astrid could see the war of hope and caution playing out across Thorne's features, understanding that her words carried implications that could reshape both their futures. The healer's judgment may have been wrong, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Or perhaps the treatments are allowing my body to heal from some injury that was never properly identified. Either way, there is reason to believe that I might not be the barren woman everyone believes me to be. The iron wedding talk seemed to pulse in the firelight, its ancient runes catching and reflecting the dancing flames, like eyes watching their conversation unfold. The bloodied battle-axe lay across Thorne's knees like a sleeping serpent, its steel blade reflecting the firelight in patterns that seemed to shift and dance with malevolent life. The weapon bore fresh stains from the morning skirmish with raiders from the eastern settlements, men who had tested Thorne's resolve and found it as sharp as forged iron. But victory had come at a cost. 3 of his warriors would not see another sunrise, and the political implications of the attack weighed heavily on everyone's minds. They probe our defenses like wolves testing a shepherd's resolve, Bjorn observed, carefully cleaning his own blade with methodical precision. The grizzled veteran's face bore new scratches from the fighting, testament to how close the conflict had been. These were not random bandits seeking easy plunder. They moved with discipline and purpose. Astrid worked quietly in the corner of the hall, preparing poultices for the wounded men who had survived the encounter. The herbs from Thorne's sister's collection had proven invaluable for treating battle injuries, and she had gained considerable skill in their application over the past weeks. Each man she tended looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and puzzlement, still unable to reconcile her healing abilities with their preconceptions about her worthlessness. "Who leads them?" Thorne asked, his pale eyes fixed on the axe blade, as if seeking answers in the reflection of steel. The weapon had belonged to his grandfather, passed down through generations of warriors who had carved their names into the saga of their bloodline through acts of courage and cunning. "Ragnar the Black," replied Olaf Redbeard, consulting notes he had gathered from questioning the few surviving raiders. "He claims descent from the old kings, says your presence here violates ancient territorial agreements. More importantly, he has been gathering support from jarls who question your legitimacy." The name hung in the air like a curse, carrying implications that made every man in the hall tense with recognition. Ragnar the Black was no mere raider. He was a political rival whose ambitions extended far beyond simple plunder. His claims to the territory were weak, but not entirely without foundation, based on genealogies that stretched back to half-remembered conflicts and marriages from decades past. "What support does he command?" Thorne's voice remained calm, but Astrid could see the tension building in his shoulders, the careful stillness that preceded explosive action. 15 ships, perhaps 300 sworn swords, Bjorn reported grimly. "Not enough to face us in open battle, but sufficient for a sustained campaign of raids and harassment. He seeks to make your position untenable, to force you into mistakes that will justify a larger coalition against you." The political calculus was brutal but clear. Ragnar the Black understood that Thorne's unconventional choices had created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies patient enough to wait for the right moment. Every raid would be followed by whispered suggestions that a proper jarl with a legitimate wife would never face such challenges, that the gods themselves were expressing displeasure through the violence that plagued the land. "There is more," Olaf continued reluctantly, his weathered face creased with the expression of a man bearing unwelcome news. During the fighting, several of our newer recruits showed hesitation, nothing that cost us the battle, but enough to suggest that doubt is taking root even among our own ranks. Astrid felt her heart clench with guilt as she understood the implications. Her presence in Thorne's household had become a symbol of his supposed poor judgment, a visible reminder that their lord valued personal desire over political necessity. Every man who died because of divided loyalties carried some portion of responsibility that belonged to her. Perhaps it is time to consider the marriage proposals more seriously, Bjorn suggested carefully, clearly aware that he was venturing into dangerous territory. The offer from Jarl Olafsson includes significant military support, 200 seasoned warriors and a fleet of warships. His daughter Sigrid is young, fertile and well-trained in the management of great households. The silence that followed was deafening. Astrid's hands stilled in their work as she felt the weight of every gaze in the hall, understanding that her fate was being decided in the space between heartbeats. The practical arguments were overwhelming. Thorne needed allies, needed the legitimacy that only a proper marriage could provide, needed to demonstrate that his personal choices would not compromise his effectiveness as a leader. Sigrid Olafsson is 16 years old, Thorne said finally, his voice carrying a note of distaste that surprised everyone present. A child who has never faced hardship, never been tested by adversity, never learned to value anything beyond her own comfort and status. She is young enough to be shaped by your guidance, Bjorn persisted, clearly committed to making his case despite the dangerous currents in his lord's mood. Young enough to bear many sons, to cement alliances that will secure your bloodline for generations. These are not small considerations, my lord. Astrid rose from her position by the wounded men, moving with careful deliberation toward the great doors of the hall. She could not bear to hear more of this conversation, could not endure watching Thorne's face as he weighed her value against the cold mathematics of political survival. But his voice stopped her before she could escape. "Where are you going?" The question was asked quietly, but it carried the weight of absolute command. Every person in the hall turned to watch her response, understanding that this moment would define the nature of their relationship going forward. She could retreat into the shadows and accept whatever decision was made about her future, or she could stand and face the consequences of speaking her mind. "I was going to tend the wounded in the outer buildings," she replied, her voice steadier than she had expected. "There are men suffering who need care more than they need to hear debates about marriage politics." "The wounded can wait," Thorne said, his pale eyes holding hers with that familiar intensity. "I would hear your thoughts on these matters. You have lived the consequences of other people's decisions about your worth. What wisdom would you offer to someone facing similar choices?" The hall erupted in barely contained murmurs of shock and disapproval. For a jarl to seek counsel from a woman of uncertain status was unprecedented, a violation of customs that had governed their society for generations. But Thorne's authority was absolute in his own hall, and no man dared to voice open objection to his methods. Astrid felt the familiar sensation of standing at a crossroads, understanding that her next words would shape not only her own destiny, but potentially the fate of everyone present. The bloodied axe across Thorne's knees seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the weapon itself was eager to learn what choice she would make. "I would say that wisdom lies in understanding the difference between strength and stubbornness," she replied carefully, her voice carrying across the silent hall with crystalline clarity. "A strong leader adapts to circumstances while remaining true to core principles. A stubborn one clings to positions that serve pride rather than purpose. And which do you believe I am demonstrating in this matter?" The question was a trap, and everyone present understood its implications. If she counseled him to marry for political advantage, she would be advocating for her own abandonment. If she argued against it, she would be asking him to sacrifice the welfare of his people for her sake. Either answer would define her as selfish or self-destructive in the eyes of those watching. "I believe you are demonstrating the burden of leadership," she said finally, choosing a path that acknowledged the complexity without offering easy solutions. Every choice you make affects hundreds of lives. The question is not what I would prefer, but what the land and the people truly need to prosper. Thorne's expression remained unreadable as he considered her words, his fingers tracing the edge of his grandfather's axe with unconscious familiarity. Around the hall, his men waited for a decision that would determine whether their lord was driven by wisdom or weakness, whether his judgment could be trusted when personal desires conflicted with political necessity. The bloodied weapon seemed to whisper of battles fought and won, of choices that had shaped the destiny of generations, of the weight of power that crushed those too weak to bear it properly. The ancient scroll crackled like autumn leaves as Astrid unrolled it with trembling fingers, the parchment so old that she feared it might disintegrate at her touch. She had discovered it hidden in the deepest recess of the wooden chest, wrapped in oiled leather and sealed with wax that bore the mark of a healer's guild from distant lands. The Latin words were faded but still legible, written in the careful script of someone who understood that knowledge was precious enough to preserve through generations, concerning the afflictions of women who cannot conceive. She read aloud in the empty chamber, her voice barely above a whisper. The translation was difficult. Her knowledge of Latin came from her grandmother's teaching, supplemented by fragments learned during her travels with the merchants. But as the meaning became clear, her heart began to race with implications that could reshape everything she thought she knew about herself. The document described a condition that the ancient healers called the false barrenness, a malady that mimicked infertility but was actually caused by the consumption of certain herbs over extended periods. The symptoms matched her own experience with disturbing precision: irregular cycles, abdominal pain, the inability to conceive despite apparent health. More importantly, the scroll detailed how merchant caravans sometimes deliberately caused this condition in their female servants to prevent the complications that pregnancy would bring to their operations. Astrid's hands shook as she read the list of herbs that could cause such effects. Juniper berries, pennyroyal, tansy, all common ingredients in the remedies that Olaf's caravan had provided for women's troubles during her 3 years of service. She had consumed them regularly, believing they were meant to ease the discomfort of her cycles, never questioning why a merchant would be so generous with expensive medicines. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had not been barren at all. She had been deliberately poisoned, her fertility stolen through calculated deception. The healer's pronouncement had been accurate at the time, but it had described an artificial condition rather than a natural one. The runes had spoken truly of her present state while remaining blind to its manufactured origins. A soft knock at the chamber door interrupted her revelations, and she quickly rolled the scroll and tucked it beneath her sleeping furs. Thorne entered at her invitation, his expression grave in the flickering candlelight. The late hour and his informal dress suggested this was a personal visit rather than an official matter. But the tension in his shoulders spoke of burdens that extended far beyond household concerns. "I received word from my scouts," he said without preamble, settling into the chair beside her sleeping area, with the careful movements of a man whose body had absorbed too many blows over the years. "Ragnar the Black has formed an alliance with 3 neighboring jarls. They plan to move against us before the spring thaw, when the roads become passable for large forces." The news was sobering but not entirely unexpected. Political pressure had been building for months, and Ragnar's growing coalition represented an existential threat to everything Thorne had worked to build. The timing was particularly challenging. Winter campaigns were difficult and expensive, but waiting for spring would give their enemies time to gather even more support. "How many men does that give him?" Astrid asked, setting aside her personal revelations to focus on the immediate crisis facing their household. "Perhaps 1,000 warriors, plus whatever mercenaries his gold can buy," Thorne replied grimly. "Enough to overwhelm our defenses if they coordinate their assault properly." My own forces number less than 400, and some of those are of questionable loyalty, given recent doubts about my judgment. The reference to his judgment was clearly aimed at their relationship. The ongoing speculation about his refusal to marry conventionally. Astrid felt the familiar weight of guilt settling on her shoulders, understanding that her presence had become a liability that threatened everyone she had grown to care about. There may be a solution, she said carefully, her mind racing through possibilities that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. But it would require trust in something that defies conventional wisdom. Thorne's pale eyes fixed on her with that familiar intensity, reading nuances in her expression that others would have missed. Speak plainly. The scroll I discovered tonight changes everything we thought we knew about my condition, she began, pulling the ancient document from its hiding place. It describes how certain herbs can create the appearance of barrenness while leaving fertility intact. The same herbs that Olaf's caravan provided for my monthly discomfort. She explained her discovery in detail, watching Thorne's expression shift from skepticism to amazement to carefully controlled anger as the implications became clear. The merchant had not been showing kindness to a damaged servant. He had been maintaining a valuable asset by preventing the inconvenience of pregnancy. Her barrenness had been as artificial as the colors used to dye expensive cloth. How long would it take to reverse the effects? Thorne asked, his voice tight with emotions he was struggling to contain. The scroll suggests that natural fertility returns within 1 or 2 cycles after the herbs are discontinued, Astrid replied, her heart hammering with the audacity of what she was about to propose. If we were to marry, truly marry, with all the ceremony and legitimacy that your position requires, there is every reason to believe that I could bear children. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of possibilities that neither of them had dared to consider seriously before this moment. Marriage between them had seemed impossible because of her supposed barrenness. But if that obstacle was revealed to be artificial, it changed the entire political calculus. The Jarls, who question my judgment, do so partly because they believe I have chosen a barren woman over fertile prospects, Thorne said slowly, working through the strategic implications. But if you were to conceive quickly after our marriage, it would demonstrate that their assumptions were wrong. It would suggest that I saw something they missed, that my judgment was superior to theirs. It would also provide the legitimacy that your position requires, Astrid added, hardly daring to believe they were seriously discussing such possibilities. A proper marriage ceremony, conducted according to ancient traditions, witnessed by the great families of the region. No one could question the validity of children born from such a union. Thorne rose from his chair and began to pace before the fire, his mind clearly working through scenarios and possibilities with the same methodical precision he applied to military planning. The ancient scroll lay between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, offering a path forward that neither had imagined possible. There are risks, he said finally, turning to face her with an expression that mixed hope and caution in equal measure. If the scroll is wrong, if your fertility does not return as described, we would face the same political challenges with the added burden of having raised false expectations. And if the coalition attacks before we can demonstrate the legitimacy of our union, the marriage itself might be seen as a desperate attempt to shore up failing authority, Astrid added, understanding that hope was a luxury they could not afford without careful calculation. But if it works, Thorne continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction, if you conceive quickly and bear a son, it would vindicate every choice I have made. It would prove that wisdom sometimes requires looking beyond surface appearances to see the truth beneath. The implications stretched far beyond their personal relationship. A successful marriage that produced legitimate heirs would strengthen Thorne's position immeasurably, providing the political stability needed to face Ragnar's coalition with confidence. It would also serve as a powerful symbol to his followers, proof that their lord's judgment was not compromised by personal weakness, but enhanced by insight that others lacked. The timing would be crucial, Astrid observed, her practical mind already working through the logistics of such a plan. The marriage would need to be announced and celebrated before the spring campaign, providing enough time for conception to become apparent to allies and enemies alike. And it would need to be done properly, Thorne added, his pale eyes bright with growing excitement. No simple hand-fasting ceremony that could be dismissed as political theatre. A full traditional wedding with all the ancient rituals, witnessed by representatives of every major family in the region. The ancient scroll seemed to pulse with possibility in the candlelight, its faded words offering a path that led from shame to vindication, from political weakness to strength, from a love that dared not speak its name to a union that could reshape the balance of power across the northern lands. But first, they would need to survive long enough to see whether the promises written by long-dead healers could overcome the accumulated weight of custom, prejudice, and political ambition that stood arrayed against them. The golden wedding crown caught the first light of dawn like captured fire, its intricate metalwork speaking of centuries of tradition and the weight of dynastic expectations. Crafted by master smiths in the time of Thorne's great-grandfather, the circlet bore runes of protection and fertility, each symbol carefully chosen to invoke the blessings of gods and ancestors upon the union it would sanctify. As Astrid stared at the crown resting on the wooden table before her, she felt the full magnitude of what was about to unfold settling across her. Shoulders like a mantle of destiny, the past week had transformed their quiet household into a hive of frantic activity as preparations for the wedding. Ceremony consumed every waking moment. Messengers had ridden out to every corner of the territory, carrying invitations written in Thorne's own hand and sealed with his personal mark. The guest list read like a catalogue of northern nobility, jarls and chieftains, merchants and warriors, representatives of ancient houses whose approval could legitimize or destroy a ruler's authority with equal ease. "The dress is ready," announced Helga, the village seamstress who had been working without rest to create a gown worthy of such an occasion. The elderly woman's fingers were pricked raw from handling the expensive silk that Thorne had purchased from traveling Byzantine merchants, but her eyes shone with pride at the masterpiece she had created. "Never in my 40 years of needlework have I crafted anything so fine." Astrid rose from her position beside the fire to examine the wedding gown, her breath catching at the beauty of the garment that would mark her transformation from nameless servant to legitimate wife of a powerful jarl. The silk was the deep blue of summer skies, embroidered with silver thread in patterns that echoed the knotwork carved into the wedding crown. The sleeves were cut in the traditional style, long and flowing, while the bodice was fitted to emphasize the feminine form without sacrificing dignity or modesty. "It is magnificent," she whispered, running her fingers over the intricate embroidery that had consumed so many hours of careful labor. Each silver thread represented not just skill and artistry, but hope, the collective investment of an entire community in the success of this unprecedented union. Beyond the chamber walls, she could hear the sounds of continued preparation echoing through the great hall. Tables were being arranged for the wedding feast. Musicians were tuning their instruments for the celebration that would follow the ceremony, and servants scurried back and forth with arms full of supplies needed to host the gathering of nobles that would begin arriving before noon. The political implications of the event weighed heavily on everyone's minds. Word of the wedding had spread far beyond their immediate territory, carrying with it speculation about Thorne's motives and the meaning of his choice. Some saw it as confirmation that their initial assessment of his judgment had been correct, that he was indeed a man who valued wisdom over convention. Others viewed it as a desperate attempt to legitimize a relationship that had always been politically damaging. "My lady," came a hesitant voice from the doorway, and Astrid turned to see one of the younger serving girls holding a wooden tray laden with herbs and oils. "Lord Thorne requests that you prepare yourself according to the old traditions. He has provided these items for the ritual cleansing. The tray contained elements that spoke to customs older than Christianity, practices that reached back to the time when marriage was seen as a sacred contract between not just two people, but two bloodlines, two destinies, two futures that would be forever intertwined. The herbs would be steeped in heated water for a ritual bath, while the oils would anoint her skin with fragrances that carried symbolic meaning. Lavender for devotion, rosemary for remembrance, sage for wisdom. As Astrid began the ancient preparations, her mind wandered to the scroll hidden beneath her sleeping furs and the knowledge it contained. 3 weeks had passed since she had discontinued the herbs that had artificially suppressed her fertility, and already she could feel changes in her body that suggested the ancient healer's words were proving accurate. Her cycles had begun to regulate themselves with a precision that had been absent for years, and she felt a vitality returning that she had almost forgotten was possible. The timing was crucial beyond mere symbolism. If the wedding night resulted in conception, as both hope and calculation suggested it might, the proof of her fertility would emerge just as Ragnar the Black's coalition prepared for their spring offensive. A pregnant wife would demonstrate conclusively that Thorne's judgment had been superior to that of his critics, that he had seen potential where others perceived only failure, but such hopes carried equal measures of promise and peril. If the ancient remedies failed to restore her fertility as promised, the marriage would become a liability rather than an asset, confirming every doubt that had been whispered about Thorne's wisdom. The political consequences of such a failure could be catastrophic, providing enemies with exactly the evidence they needed to justify rebellion against his authority. "The guests are beginning to arrive," Helga reported, returning from a reconnaissance mission to the main hall. "I have seen banners from House Eriksson, House Olafsson, and House Ragnarsson. Even Jarl Magnus has come, though he brings few retainers and keeps his own council." Each name carried political weight, representing alliances that could shift based on their assessment of this wedding's legitimacy and likelihood of success. Jarl Magnus, in particular, was known for his careful neutrality in disputes between nobles, making his presence both encouraging and nerve-wracking. His opinion carried significant influence among the moderate faction of northern leaders, and his public endorsement or criticism could sway others who remained undecided. "What of enemies?" Astrid asked, understanding that not every response to their invitation would be friendly. "Several notable absences," Helga replied grimly. "Houses that have declared for Ragnar the Black sent polite regrets, claiming pressing concerns that prevent their attendance. But there are also surprises. Some jarls who were expected to side with the coalition have come anyway, suggesting that loyalties may be more fluid than either side anticipated." The political chess game was complex beyond easy prediction, with each participant weighing their own interests against the shifting balance of power that this wedding represented. Success would strengthen Thorne's position immeasurably, while failure could trigger the very rebellion that everyone feared. A commotion in the courtyard drew their attention to the windows, where they could see an impressive procession approaching the gates. The banners identified the new arrivals as representatives of House Grimson, distant relatives of Thorne's family who had travelled from their holdings in the far north to witness this momentous occasion. Their presence was particularly significant, as it demonstrated that even his own bloodline was willing to publicly support his unconventional choice. "Your cousin Eriksson has come," Helga observed, squinting at the approaching riders. "And he brings his full household guard, 40 men in battle array. Either he expects trouble, or he wants to make a statement about the strength of family loyalty." The sight of armed men approaching should have been alarming, but Astrid found herself oddly comforted by the display of martial readiness. The wedding was taking place in an atmosphere of barely controlled political tension, and having reliable warriors present might prove essential if diplomacy failed to contain the ambitions of those who opposed Thorne's rule. As the morning progressed toward the appointed hour of ceremony, Astrid completed her ritual preparations with meticulous attention to every traditional requirement. The bath infused with sacred herbs left her skin soft and fragrant, while the oils applied according to ancient formula were said to invoke divine blessing upon the union about to be consecrated. The wedding dress fitted her form perfectly, its rich fabric and elaborate embroidery marking her transformation from woman of uncertain status to bride of one of the most powerful men in the Northern Territories. The golden crown awaited its moment, resting on its cushion like a promise of the future that she and Thorne were about to claim together. When she finally placed it upon her head, the weight was both physical and symbolic, the accumulated expectations of generations of women who had worn it before her, each adding their own story to its gleaming surface. "You look like a queen," Helga whispered, her weathered face soft with emotions that spoke to every woman's dreams of witnessing such transformations. No man present will doubt that Lord Thorne has chosen well, but even as Astrid admired her reflection in the polished metal that served as a mirror, her mind remained focused on the challenges that lay ahead. The ceremony itself was only the beginning. The real test would come in the months that followed, when the success or failure of their union would be measured not in words or symbols, but in the practical realities of pregnancy, political stability, and military victory. Through the chamber windows, she could see more guests arriving as the hour of ceremony approached. Each new banner represented another voice that would judge their choices, another opinion that could influence the fragile balance of alliances that held their world together. Some came as friends, others as enemies, but all would bear witness to a wedding that promised to reshape the political landscape of the Northern Territories. The Golden Crown seemed to pulse with ancient power as Astrid prepared to leave the chamber and walk toward a destiny that would be written in the minutes and hours to come. Whatever the future held, she would meet it not as a victim of other people's choices, but as a woman who had reclaimed agency over her own fate. Supported by a man who had seen worth where others perceived only damage, the wedding bells began to ring, their bronze voices carrying across the fjord like a declaration that could not be ignored or forgotten. The ceremonial drinking horn gleamed like polished amber in the afternoon sunlight, its carved surface depicting scenes of ancient weddings, where gods and mortals had witnessed the binding of souls across the generations. Made from the horn of an aurochs killed by Thorne's grandfather during his legendary hunt in the deep forests, the vessel carried the weight of family history and the promise of futures yet to be written. As Astrid accepted the horn from the elderly priest, she felt the eyes of 200 assembled nobles, weighing every gesture, every expression, every breath, by the old gods and the new, by fire and ice, by earth and sky, the priest intoned in a voice that carried across the hushed assembly like thunder before a storm. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he guided her through the ancient ritual, understanding that he was participating in a ceremony that would be remembered for generations. "Do you, Astrid Eriksdotter, take this man as your husband, your lord, your companion, through all the trials that fate may bring?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and fragile, and charged with possibilities that could reshape the political landscape of the Northern Territories. Around the ceremonial circle, Astrid could see faces that represented every faction of noble society, some watching with approval, others with barely concealed hostility, all of them aware that her answer would determine the course of events for years to come. "I do," she replied, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd despite the trembling in her hands. The drinking horn felt warm against her palms, as if the carved bone itself was alive with the accumulated hopes and dreams of all the brides who had drunk from it before her. She raised the vessel to her lips and tasted the honeyed mead within, its sweetness mixed with herbs that had been blessed according to traditions older than memory. The liquid was said to carry the favor of the fertility goddess, ensuring that unions consecrated with its blessing would bear fruit in the form of strong children and lasting prosperity. When she passed the horn to Thorne, their fingers touched for a moment that seemed to stretch across eternity. His pale eyes met hers with an intensity that spoke of promises deeper than words, of understanding that transcended the political calculations that had brought them to this moment. In that brief contact, she felt the full weight of his commitment, not just to her as a woman, but to the future they would build together against all who sought to tear it down, by the old gods and the new. By fire and ice, by earth and sky, Thorne repeated, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded warriors across a dozen battlefields. I, Thorne Grimson, take this woman as my wife, my partner, my equal in all things that matter. Let any who would challenge this union face the consequences of defying the will of the gods themselves. The challenge was unmistakable, directed at those present who questioned his choice and those absent who plotted against his rule. As he drank from the ceremonial horn, completing the ancient ritual that bound them together in the eyes of divine and mortal law, a murmur ran through the assembled crowd like wind through wheat fields. Let the binding be witnessed and remembered, the priest declared, raising his staff topped with symbols that predated the coming of Christianity to these lands. What the gods have joined, let no mortal power divide. The ceremony continued with rituals that traced their origins to the very foundation of their culture. Rings were exchanged, simple bands of gold that had been blessed in the sacred flames and inscribed with runes that promised protection and prosperity. Hands were bound with cords of silk and silver, symbolizing the intertwining of their destinies in ways that could never be undone. But it was the moment when Thorne placed the golden wedding crown upon her, a head that truly transformed Astrid from woman of uncertain status to legitimate lady of one of the most powerful houses in the Northern Territories. The weight of the circlet seemed to settle into her very bones, carrying with it the accumulated authority of generations of noble wives who had worn it before her. "Behold, Lady Astrid Grimson," Thorne announced, his voice carrying across the assembly with the force of absolute proclamation. "My wife, my partner, the future mother of my heirs. Let all who serve House Grimson show her the respect and loyalty due to her station." The response was immediate and varied. Thorne's own warriors stepped forward as one to offer their formal acknowledgement, their voices raised in the traditional pledge of loyalty that bound them to protect and serve their lord's household. Many of the assembled nobles followed suit, understanding that political wisdom required them to accept the accomplished fact, regardless of their private reservations. But not everyone was prepared to offer such ready acceptance. Astrid could see clusters of men whose faces remained carefully neutral, their silence speaking as loudly as any words of protest. These were the representatives of houses that had not yet committed to either side in the coming conflict, waiting to see whether this unprecedented union would prove to be inspired wisdom or fatal miscalculation. Near the back of the assembly, she caught sight of a familiar figure that made her heart clench with old pain. Her father Ericsson, standing with the village elders who had been granted permission to witness the ceremony that elevated his discarded daughter to heights he had never imagined possible. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions, pride warring with regret, understanding warring with the stubborn prejudices that had led him to trade her for silver. The ceremonial drinking horn passed from hand to hand among the wedding party, each sip binding the assembled witnesses to the legitimacy of what they had witnessed. When it returned to Astrid and Thorne for the final toast, the vessel seemed to pulse with the accumulated power of every blessing and oath that had been spoken over its carved surface. The war horn's mournful cry shattered the festive atmosphere like a blade through silk, its bronze voice carrying across the wedding celebration with news that no one wanted to hear, but everyone had been expecting. The horn bore the battle scars of a dozen campaigns, its surface dented and scratched, but still capable of producing the haunting call that summoned warriors to face their destiny. As the last echoes faded across the fjord, silence fell over the assembled guests like a burial shroud. Ragnar the Black approaches with his full army, reported the messenger who had ridden his horse nearly to death to bring the warning. Blood streaked his face from a wound that spoke of recent combat, and his armor bore fresh dents that testified to the reality of the threat bearing down upon them. Perhaps 800 men, moving fast along the coastal road. They will be here before sunset. The timing was no coincidence. Ragnar had planned his assault to coincide with the wedding celebration, knowing that many of Thorne's potential allies would be present but unprepared for immediate battle. It was a calculated gamble that spoke to both strategic cunning and desperate ambition, an attempt to end the political crisis through decisive military action. "How long do we have?" Thorne demanded, his transformation from bridegroom to battle commander accomplished in the space between heartbeats. The golden circlet still rested upon Astrid's head, but his hand had already moved to the sword that hung at his side, even during the sacred ceremony. 2 hours, perhaps 3 if they stopped to rest their men, the messenger replied, swaying slightly in his saddle from exhaustion and blood loss. They carry siege ladders and grappling hooks. This is no raid, but a full assault intended to take the stronghold. Around the great hall, the assembled wedding guests began to sort themselves into their true allegiances, with the ruthless efficiency of people who had always known this moment would come. Thorne's sworn allies moved immediately to his side, their hands reaching for weapons that had been ceremonially peace-bound for the wedding, but could be quickly freed for battle. Other nobles backed away toward the doors, clearly calculating whether departure or neutrality offered the better chance of survival. "My lords and ladies," Thorne announced, his voice carrying the authority that had held his forces together through a dozen campaigns. "Those who would stand with House Grimson in this trial are welcome to take up arms in our defense. Those who prefer to seek safety elsewhere are free to depart now. While the roads remain open, the offer was both generous and shrewd, allowing potential enemies to remove themselves from the conflict, while binding allies more closely through the shared choice to face danger together. Several of the neutral nobles accepted the invitation to leave, their swift departure revealing loyalties that had been carefully concealed until this moment of crisis. But others remained, including some whose presence surprised even Thorne's closest advisors. Jarl Magnus stepped forward, his weathered hand resting on his sword hilt with familiar ease. "House Magnus has no love for Ragnar the Black," he declared in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall. "We stand with legitimate authority against those who would tear down proper order." His declaration prompted a cascade of similar announcements, as fence-sitters committed themselves to one side or another. The political mathematics were complex but increasingly favorable. Thorne's forces, bolstered by wedding guests who chose to stay and fight, would outnumber Ragnar's army by a narrow but potentially decisive margin. "My lady," Bjorn Ironarm addressed Astrid directly, his scarred face serious with the weight of military necessity, "you should withdraw to the inner chambers where you can be protected if the walls are breached. This is no place for a bride on her wedding day." "This is exactly the place for a bride on her wedding day," Astrid replied, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her throat like a living thing. "If my husband fights for our future, then I will not cower in chambers while that future is decided by others." The response earned approving nods from several of the warriors present, men who understood that courage came in many forms, and that a leader's wife who shared the risks earned a different kind of respect than one who accepted only the privileges. "What would you have me do?" she asked Thorne directly, meeting his pale gaze with determination that surprised even herself. The golden wedding crown caught the firelight as she turned her head, its ancient runes seeming to pulse with power, drawn from generations of strong women who had faced similar trials. "Tend the wounded as they come," he replied, after a moment's consideration. "Your skills with healing herbs will be needed before this day ends. And if the worst should happen, "It will not," she interrupted firmly, understanding that doubt had no place in the hours ahead. "We have come too far and risked too much to fail now. The gods did not bring us together, only to tear us apart at the first test of our resolve." The war horn sounded again from the watchtowers, confirming that enemy forces had been sighted approaching through the mountain passes. Time for preparation was running short, but the defenders moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had faced death before and found it wanting. As Thorne strapped on his battle armor and took up the weapons that would determine their fate, Astrid gathered the healing supplies that would be needed to treat the inevitable casualties. The warhorn's bronze voice continued to echo across the fjord, its ancient metal bearing witness to another chapter in the endless saga of love and war that defined their harsh but magnificent world. The silver baby rattle lay, cradled in Astrid's palm like a promise fulfilled, its delicate bells chiming softly with each breath of the spring breeze that carried the scent of new growth across the rebuilt settlement. Crafted by the village silversmith as a gift for the heir of House Grimson, the rattle bore intricate engravings that told the story of their triumph, scenes of battle interwoven with symbols of fertility and renewal, a tangible reminder of how love and courage had overcome the forces arrayed against them. 6 months had passed since the battle that had decided everything in the space of a single afternoon. Ragnar the Black's assault had broken against the walls of the stronghold like waves against granite cliffs. His coalition of ambitious jarls discovering too late that political calculation was no match for genuine loyalty forged in the crucible of shared hardship. The war horn that had summoned defenders to their posts now hung silent in the great hall, its bronze voice no longer needed to announce threats that had been permanently resolved. "He grows strong," Thorne observed, settling beside his wife on the bench that overlooked the training yards where his men practiced their craft. Their son, barely 3 months old, but already showing the robust health that promised a future as formidable as his lineage, slept peacefully in Astrid's arms. Oblivious to the political upheaval his very existence had caused throughout the northern territories, the child's conception had become the stuff of legend almost before his birth, proof that Thorne's wisdom had transcended conventional understanding in ways that his enemies had been unable to foresee. The ancient scrolls' promises had proven accurate in every detail. Astrid's fertility had returned with a vengeance once the merchant's artificial suppressants were purged from her system, and their wedding night had indeed resulted in the pregnancy that validated every risk they had taken. "The messenger from Jarl Olafsson arrived this morning," Astrid reported, gently adjusting the swaddling that kept their son warm against the lingering chill of early spring. "He formally withdraws his daughter's marriage proposal and requests permission to negotiate a trade agreement instead. It seems that political alliances are easier to arrange when you no longer appear to be making desperate choices." The transformation in their political position had been as dramatic as it was swift. Noble houses that had questioned Thorne's judgment now sought his counsel on matters of governance and military strategy. The marriage that had seemed like evidence of weakness had become a symbol of strength, proof that a truly wise leader could see potential where others perceived only problems. "What of your father?" Thorne asked, his voice carefully neutral in the way that suggested deeper currents beneath the surface calm. "He comes to the naming ceremony next week," Astrid replied, her own feelings about the reconciliation still complex after so many years of pain. "He wishes to make amends, to acknowledge that his choice was born of fear rather than wisdom. It will take time to rebuild what was broken, but perhaps our son deserves grandparents who understand the cost of their mistakes." The naming ceremony would be another political statement, a gathering of allied houses to witness the formal recognition of the heir who guaranteed House Grimson's continuation for another generation. But for Astrid, it represented something more personal, the completion of a journey that had transformed her from discarded daughter to respected lady, from symbol of shame to embodiment of hope. "The village prospers," she continued. gesturing toward the settlement that sprawled beyond the stronghold walls. "The new families you allow to settle here have brought skills we needed. A proper weaver, a master carpenter, even a scholar who can teach reading to the children. This place feels less like a fortress and more like a home." The observation pleased Thorne in ways that military victories could not match. Building something that would outlast their own lives required more than conquest. It demanded the patient work of creating institutions and traditions that would serve generations yet to come. Their son would inherit not just lands and titles, but a thriving community that could sustain itself through whatever challenges the future might bring. "There is news from the eastern settlements as well," Thorne added, pulling a letter from his belt that bore the seal of a distant jarl. "Lord Eric wishes to arrange a marriage between his eldest son and our daughter, when we have one. He offers a bride price that suggests he values the alliance highly," Astrid laughed. A sound like silver bells that carried genuine amusement at the presumption involved in planning marriages for children not yet conceived. "Perhaps we should focus on raising the son we have before arranging the futures of those who exist only in hope." "Perhaps," Thorne agreed, though his smile suggested he was pleased by the confidence others showed in their continued prosperity. "Though it is good to know that our children will have choices their parents never enjoyed." The silver rattle chimed again as their son stirred in his sleep, tiny fingers grasping at air as if trying to capture the dreams that played behind his closed eyelids. In his peaceful face, Astrid could see echoes of both his parents, Thorne's determined jaw, her own stubborn intelligence. The promise of a future where strength would be measured not just in sword skill, but in wisdom and compassion. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the merchant caravan had never returned?" she asked, voicing a question that had haunted her quiet moments since their triumph. "Every day," Thorne replied honestly, his pale eyes distant with memories of paths not taken. "But I have learned that wondering about different choices is less important than making the most of the ones we did make. We found each other when we needed to, loved when it seemed impossible, and built something worth defending. The rest is just stories for the skalds to embroider." The spring afternoon stretched before them like an unwritten saga, filled with possibilities that seemed as limitless as the sky above the fjord. Their son would grow up in a world where his parents' love was legend rather than scandal, where wisdom was valued over convention, where the future was shaped by those brave enough to challenge the limitations imposed by others. The silver rattle would be the first of many gifts their child would receive. But perhaps the most precious inheritance they could provide was the knowledge that love, real, tested, triumphant love, could overcome any obstacle when supported by courage, wisdom, and the willingness to fight for what truly mattered.